transitioning now to something very serious, and that is
Yes.
the new Cold War with China that is being pushed by the United States. And of course, there are a range of things that are thrown at you, thrown at me, thrown at all of us as reasons why we should hate China. One of the main ones has been around what is happening in Xinjiang, which is, the large western region of China, and there have been pretty much every claim that you could make, from forced slavery to genocide, about the Chinese government's practices. It's been the center of quite a number of sanctions and other pieces. But there's a lot going on, and there's a new report that's out recently that is detailing, in the words of the authors, it's 3 Italian think tanks, that most of the claims that are being made about Xinjiang are, in fact, not correct, and that it's being used to fuel a propaganda campaign. So that, of course, has continued to stoke the flames of this controversy. And we are very happy to be joined, as we continue the show, by KJ No, who's a journalist, a scholar, a peace activist, works with Pivot to Peace. KJ, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
So the pleasure is all ours. And where I wanted to start here is, maybe less starting with the content of the report, but it seems to me that there's almost no other country on earth where you can have such demonization on the basis of claims, most of which are not proven, but nevertheless, the largest, most powerful countries in the world, other than China, are sanctioning China, are issuing statements. I mean, it really just seems, KJ, from just the point of view of how you evaluate any topic, that the rush to judgment here is very far ahead of most of the evidence.
Oh, absolutely. And, following on your statement, I would argue that what we are in this current moment is war. I mean, this is war. It's a Cold War, and heading towards kinetic warfare. And prior to kinetic warfare, there is a subkinetic or a pre-kinetic phase. We're in that pre-kinetic, subkinetic phase, and that is all about information warfare. That is to say that everything that you are hearing, you should take with a grain of salt, because it's currently part of a mass propaganda campaign, not unlike the WMD campaign, to demonize China. We see this coming in different phases. First, the demonization with Chinese are dirty, they eat bats, they're despicable, they're deceitful, they're dangerous, they're depraved, they're dangerous, they're demonic. It's absolute and total demonization for the purposes of manufacturing consent, stoking mass hatred to legitimate war, kinetic war against China.
I appreciate that framing, because I think that it's very important this is an information warfare, and that's why reports like these play an important role. The title of the report is Xinjiang: Understanding Complexity, Building Peace. I'm wondering what you're thinking about this report, KJ, and how important do you think it is in the broader conversation that is being had on this issue?
Well, it's an important report in that it's a series of respected independent scholars and institutions who have done their own investigation, come to their own conclusions, and essentially come to the conclusion that there's nothing untoward going on. These are genuine, legitimate de-radicalization efforts that are taking place in the context of decades-long terrorism. So it is important in that sense, but it comes on the heels of many reports. The Swedish came out with a report also debunking the genocide. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation sent a report also defending China. The UN Human Rights Commission also received a report from 60 odd Islamic majority countries defending China's policies. So these reports continue to come out, and yet they're drowned and they're erased in the general media, so that we're always left with this impression that there's something atrocious going on when it is actually fabrication.
I'm curious to get into before we maybe get into some of the things that the report does talk about, because it goes into some of these accusations, I found it interesting that the report also discusses the reason for these accusations. Um, so, why, according to the report, are countries like the US making these accusations? What is it really about?
Well, essentially, the point they're making is the point that I have been making continuously. Is that, in the context there is a kind of global war. There is a kind of attempt to take down China. This is an attempt to delegitimate China inside a very, very complex context in which China is making good faith efforts to prevent radicalism, to prevent separatism, and to ensure security. And so this has all been reframed and misinterpreted, and deliberately so, as some kind of genocidal campaign. The idea is to throw as much as you can against the wall, see what sticks, and then leave people with the general impression that something terrible is going on. It's like what they call Pascal's wager. In a situation where there's not enough information, if you allege terrible, terrible consequences, then the kind of rational decision is that we believe it despite our doubts, because the consequences of not believing are so horrific. And that's the strategy that's happening right now. It's also an appeal to people's empathy. It's an abuse of people's empathy, because we all care and we all have concerns about our fellow human beings. But this is a weaponization of that humanity and that empathy in the most manipulative manner possible.
Yeah, one of the things that the report deals with very early on that I think is very important, and it's actually related to an article that was in the New York Times yesterday that you might have also seen, KJ, about a controversy around Kodak taking down some photos put forward by a guy that's putting out a book of his photos in Xinjiang. But the photographer told the New York Times that one of the things that he was trying to bring out is that from his perspective, as he put it, the Han Chinese presence in Xinjiang is comparable to the white American presence in the Western United States. Essentially, that was a form of settler colonialism. And this is actually early on in the report, actually talks about some of that history of the region, the issue of the Chinese presence. And I'm wondering how you evaluate that claim, because I have seen that more and more since it's the western part of China. People are saying, oh, this is like American manifest destiny in an attempt to demean the Chinese government.
Well, very briefly, the Han Chinese have been in that region from about 134 BC. So they predate any Uyghur settlements by about 800 years. So the kind of irredentist claim doesn't really obtain. That area has always been an area that has been very multi-ethnic. It's been part of the Silk Road, and over the history, many, many different groups have inhabited. So a kind of fundamental irredentist claim doesn't obtain. But it's an interesting analogy, and it's actually a very powerful one, because the analogy is one of settler colonial genocide. Now, to put it very briefly, the Chinese do not have a history of settler colonial genocide the way that the West does, and certainly not the way that the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, all of these are fundamentally genocidal colonial states. But this is an effective tactic because it allows the projection and the guilt to be displaced onto another other, and it absolutely is belied by the facts. The fact is, and this is very, very clear to show, is that the indigenous and ethnic minority populations in China have many, many more privileges than the Han majority. They have privileges in schooling, hiring, birth control. In fact, they were, until very recently, they were all exempt from the single child policy. And all of them, even the smallest ethnic minorities, some of which are maybe 2,000 or 3,000, they all have legislative representation at the National People's Congress. I would ask you, do the Iroquois, do the Hopi, do the, do any of the Native American tribes have systemic representation at the U.S. Congress? And I'm not talking about Elizabeth Warren.
I hear you on that. I think that's a very important point. I mean, a deeper point than some people know, because there are treaties that were made between the United States and certain organizations, the Cherokee in particular, that they are supposed to be represented in Congress, but of course they are not. The U.S. refuses to recognize that or almost any of the traditional treaty rights. They've just decided that that's totally ridiculous. But I appreciate that framing, because I think that's extraordinarily important about the actual history of the region and what's being put forward. And another piece I'm wondering, KJ, is how much of this is also economic warfare against China? I mean, I know this is a very rapidly growing region. There are some important industries there, but it's also just, becoming more of a center of agriculture and other pieces.
There is an economic dimension of it. And essentially, the U.S. project is to create economic disruption in order to stoke resentment and then later, through that process, increase separatist radicalism. That's the plan. And so, for example, Xinjiang is one of the largest producers of cotton. Now, most of that cotton is harvested mechanically, but the U.S. is alleging, without a smidgen of proof, that it is all harvested by slave labor. And once again, we can see the projection going on. There is a country that grew that amassed tremendous wealth through slave labor in cotton. So these are very easy projections and displacements. But the fact is that once you do that, it's estimated some 600,000 Uyghurs will be put out of work because of this. And they're also alleging this with polysilicon. They're alleging that any kind of manufacturing that happens in Xinjiang is tainted with slave labor. And the result of this is that corporations that have a supply chain or a connection with the United States are refusing to hire Uyghurs now. And so we have both allegations. One is that these Chinese corporations are discriminating against Uyghurs. At the same time, the ones that are hiring them are being accused of slave labor. It's a situation where they can't win, but fundamentally it shows the fundamental bad faith of this information warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And on the economic front, one thing that I found interesting is the report actually goes into how the Chinese government over the last several decades has actually economically developed Xinjiang in a way that it wasn't before, and in a way that's benefited the people there, which I think is really interesting. I mean, building, just the basic things like building roads, building public infrastructure, ways for people to get around. And so it's odd, well, not odd, it's understandable, I guess, but it's interesting how U.S. government accusations have managed to get the entire media on board with portraying Xinjiang as a place that's being economically oppressed in this way. But moreover, what I found interesting too is the report notes that 1,200 people, representatives from more than 100 countries, including UN officials, UN permanent representatives, diplomats, journalists, and representatives of religious institutions, have visited Xinjiang between the years of 2018 and 2020 and have found no evidence of these claims. And so a lot of these claims are coming from people who haven't even been there.
Absolutely.
Am I right
So
to
they
say
haven't.
that?
Yes, absolutely. The ones who are making these claims are usually quote unquote China watchers, usually tied to the World Uyghur Congress or various victims of victims of communism memorial foundation or other U.S. Or Australian Five Eyes think tanks. Now, the actual letter from the representatives of 60 odd countries says that they commend China's commitment to openness and transparency. They have undertaken de-radicalization, counterterrorism measures where the rights of all ethnic groups are safeguarded. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation commends the efforts of the People's Republic of China in providing care to its Muslim citizens. This is the group that represents or defends the human rights of Muslims all over the world. They're the voice and the guard of 1.8 billion Muslims in the world. Their finding is that they commend the care of the People's Republic of China towards its Muslim citizens. Thousands of diplomats, statesmen, investigative journalists, professionals, experts, lawyers have investigated Xinjiang and the allegations, and they've all come back empty. They said there is no there. Even the State Department's own lawyers have not been able to, corroborate it. So, I mean, there's no there. The International Criminal Court had reams of quote unquote evidence thrown against it. It said, we cannot investigate. We cannot even open a preliminary investigation because there is no materiality to this. Remember, genocide, crimes against humanity are what are called jus cogens. It means there's universal jurisdiction. An investigation can be opened anytime. International Criminal Court refused to open an investigation, essentially saying that you do not have a case.
And I'm curious, KJ, can you speak to the relevance of the Belt and Road Initiative here and its importance in Xinjiang? Because we know that the U.S. finds the Belt and Road Initiative to be a threat to its own hegemony all around the world. So what is Xinjiang's importance in the Belt and Road Initiative?
Very simply, the United States is encircling China with 400 bases all along its periphery, along what is called the rimland. And in particular, it seeks to choke China off at the South China Sea, where $5.3 trillion worth of goods travel through and 70% of China's oil. China's escape route, its escape from this encirclement, has been this kind of long march overland towards Eurasia, Central Asia, Africa. And that belt and road, this kind of overland path, passes through Xinjiang, through the Xinjiang region. And so the US needs to choke off the Belt and Road in order to isolate China, in order to be able to strangle China, and to prevent it from becoming a regional center of gravity that has connections to the rest of the other countries. Now, the point is that the Xinjiang abords 8 countries, 5 of which are Muslim majority. So the Belt and Road, which is primarily roads and rail, travels through Xinjiang and then goes into other Central Asian countries, traverses Iran, comes out through Pakistan and Myanmar, another place where you see conflict. And the US plan is and has been to use Xinjiang separatism. And they've said this explicitly. Siebel Edmonds, Wilkerson, they've all said that there's explicit plans to create disruption for China in the Xinjiang area. And then this would essentially disrupt China's growth and its ability to become a regional pole of development against the Western imperial powers.
Well, it's definitely an
And
important
I'm
point.
curious.
Go ahead.
Well, I had one more question just about the issue of terrorism here, because one thing that often gets left out of this conversation, which is ironic, is that China did have a reaction in Xinjiang to the issue of terrorist attacks, and a lot of the U.S. accusations about what China is doing to Muslims can actually be put on the U.S. I mean, the U.S. after 9/11, right, went around the world literally creating black sites and kidnapping people, Muslims, and then torturing them in really obscene ways. That said, what is the issue, the counterterrorism angle here of what's happening in Xinjiang? Because in the U.S. we don't hear about this at all.
Well, since the 90s, China has had about 2,000 terror attacks on its soil until more recently when it implemented stricter de-radicalization measures. And so it's been subject to a wave of Takfiri, Salafist, uh, ethno-nationalist terrorism, primarily from ETIM and ETLO. These are terrorist organizations that believe in creating a Salafist Muslim state inside the borders of China with some strange, unprovable, irredentist claims. And so this has been the key issue. China has seen wave and wave of killings, not only in the Xinjiang region, but in Kunming, in Beijing, all over China. And these have resulted sometimes in huge casualties, hundreds, over 100 dead, and sometimes hundreds wounded. So these are very, very serious issues. And the Chinese response has been to roll out, because the Chinese are Marxists, they see this as a kind of material issue. They think that if we improve the material conditions of Xinjiang, which they have, Xinjiang, since its inception, its wealth has grown about 1,600% at this current point. Its population has doubled since the early 2000s, and 25% in the last 8 years. So it's constantly growing. But the Chinese approach has been to attend to material needs in order to remove the kind of ground or environment that is potent for radicalization. At the same time, that there is a real and constant threat. 5,000 radical Uyghurs were fighting in Xinjiang in collaboration with IS. The early connections with the ETIM go all the way back to Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So this is a real issue, and this has been largely erased from the picture and framed as purely kind of a domestic human rights violation.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, in addition to what you're saying, there are 5,000, till now, there are 5,000 Uyghurs living in northern Syria in a town called Jizr-e-Shahur, which used to belong to Syrians, but have been taken over. They went there as part of the foreign fighters, the jihad that came to try to collapse the Syrian state and install an Islamic state. So yeah, there's an actual, result of this that exists in Syria right now, of this group that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And just to say, all of this goes back, to Operation Cyclone, the US plan to weaponize radical Islam against Afghanistan, which then spread to the rest of Central Asia. And we're looking at, decades of this blowback, which the Chinese are trying to manage in a way which is very, very different from what the United States has been doing, which is to bomb them and blow them to bits.
Well, one final piece that I also want to ask you about, KJ, is I think when a lot of this propaganda is out there, many people hear about the World Uyghur Congress. They're certainly getting support from the United States. I mean, what is this institution? What's their relationship to the U.S. as well?
Well, they're funded by the NED. They have very, very close connections to the U.S. intelligence services, and it's considered that they are a proxy of ETIM. They're kind of the political arm of ETIM. Regardless of how you see it, they're fundamentally opposed to China. They believe in creating a separatist, ethno-nationalist state, and they are willing to do anything and take any measures in order to establish themselves. The example that I think of is, in Iran, there is another group that is similar to them. That is, yes, MEK, and they receive the same kind of neocon support.
really is a lot here and so much that is just not in any way contextualized or covered correctly. So I really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side, KJ, and help shedding some light on some of these important issues.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting me and covering this critical issue.
Absolutely.